The Soviet-Afghan War, often referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam War, was a decade-long conflict that had profound and lasting consequences for both the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. The intervention, which began at Christmas 1979, was intended to support the communist government of Afghanistan against the Mujahideen, who saw themselves as fighting a holy war. This costly engagement resulted in the deaths of over 25,000 Soviet soldiers and countless Afghan casualties, ultimately contributing to the collapse of the USSR. The roots of Russian interest in Central Asia, including Afghanistan, can be traced back to the imperial ambitions of Tsarist Russia in the 1730s. This expansionist program led to Russia's gradual conquest of the region, advancing south into the Caucasus and Crimea. By the late 1830s, Afghanistan became a focal point. Following the Russo-Persian War, 1826 to 1828, Russia subtly influenced government circles in Tehran, and in 1837, Russian advisors supported Persian forces in their attempt to seize Herat in western Afghanistan. This move raised alarms in British India, leading to a forced Persian withdrawal and the beginning of the Great Game, a geopolitical rivalry between the British and Russian empires for influence in Central Asia, primarily Afghanistan and the northern regions of British India. Concerned that Afghanistan as a buffer state would fall under Russian control, the British and East India Company forces invaded Afghanistan in 1838. Despite the Afghans refusing to accept a Russian envoy prior to the invasion, British concerns persisted even after Russia's defeat in the Crimean War in 1856. By 1869, the Russian frontier reached Afghanistan's northern border. The British Raj invaded Afghanistan again in 1878, withdrawing 3 years later after securing control over Afghan foreign affairs. The Great Game officially ended with the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which delineated spheres of influence: Central Asia and northern Iraq for Russia, and Afghanistan and southern Iraq for Britain. This treaty, however, collapsed in 1919 after Afghan troops incited a revolt in British India, leading to the Third Anglo-Afghan War and Afghanistan's complete independence from British control. From 1919 to 1978, Afghanistan navigated a delicate balancing act between external powers like the US, Britain, and Germany, and its regional neighbors. In 1973, King Mohammad Zahir Shah, who had ruled since 1933, was overthrown by his cousin and former Prime Minister, Mohammad Daoud Khan, in a coup. Daoud initiated reforms aimed at eradicating Islamic fundamentalism, modernizing society, and emancipating women. These changes were met with fierce opposition from Islamists, who sought refuge and training with the Pakistani Secret Service across the border. Among these individuals were Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Ahmad Shah Massoud, both members of the Mujahideen, who would later play pivotal roles in the Afghan Civil War. Despite receiving arms shipments from the Soviet Union, Daoud dismissed Soviet advisors sent by Leonid Brezhnev after a disagreement with the Afghan Communist Party, also known as the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA. This led to Soviet concerns about Afghanistan aligning with the West. The turning point came in April 1977 during Daoud's visit to Moscow, when Brezhnev protested the expansion of NATO and US influence in Afghanistan. Daoud's defiant response, asserting Afghanistan's independence, angered Brezhnev. In the spring of 1978, the assassination of a high-ranking Communist Party member led Daoud to attempt a crackdown, but the Saur Revolution, a successful coup staged by the PDPA, resulted in the execution of Daoud and his family in the presidential palace. Although the Soviet Union did not directly participate in the coup, Brezhnev did not intervene to prevent it. Nur Mohammad Taraki, a pro-Soviet figure, became the new president, and the country was renamed the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, adopting a red flag similar to the Soviet Union's. Taraki's Marxist reforms, which included promoting education and controversially empowering women by banning forced marriages and discouraging veiling, were seen as anti-Islamic by many conservative Afghans. The PDPA itself was fractured into two factions, the Khalqis led by Taraki and the more moderate Parkamis led by Babrak Karmal. The Khalqis systematically persecuted the Parkamis, especially as the Soviet Union favored the Parkami faction's less radical approach to change. These rapid and often insensitive reforms, particularly land reforms that ignored local needs and the concept of liberated women, deeply outraged the Islamic population. Before the Soviet intervention, the Khalq government executed between 10,000 and 27,000 people, primarily at Puli Charkhi jail. Political scientist Olivier Roy estimated that between 50,000 and 100,000 people disappeared during the Taraki Amin period. The rise of Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran in early 1979 and his policy of exporting Islamic doctrines to countries with similar militant beliefs further complicated the situation. Khomeini began supplying arms to the Afghan Mujahideen, who vehemently opposed the PDPA and its Soviet backers. Taraki responded by forming the secret police, dubbed the Afghan Interests Protection Service, and ordered a crackdown on opponents, leading to thousands of imprisonments and executions. Inevitably, a rebellion erupted in the city of Herat in March 1979, with Mujahideen chanting, "God is great," as hundreds of Afghans and Soviet advisors were killed, tortured, and murdered under the orders of Hafizullah Amin, Taraki's right-hand man. Despite Amin's brutal actions, Taraki's pleas for Soviet military assistance were initially refused due to Soviet fears of provoking their own Muslim population and getting bogged down in a Soviet Vietnam. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin explicitly stated that committing ground troops would be a fatal mistake and would worsen the situation. Brezhnev advised easing reforms and removing Amin. However, during a meeting in Moscow in 1979, Taraki secured some Soviet support. The Herat uprising escalated into an open revolt, plunging the entire country into war. Amin, aware of a threat to his life, survived an assassination attempt by Taraki and, with army backing, had Taraki arrested. Taraki was reportedly suffocated in his cell in October 1979, though the Afghan media reported his death as an illness. With Amin now in charge, the regime was on the verge of collapse. Moscow debated intervention, viewing Amin as fanatical and incompetent. They also suspected US and Chinese sponsorship of the Mujahideen through Pakistan. The Soviet plan was to replace Amin with the more moderate Parkami communist, Babruk Karmal. Despite concerns from Chief of Soviet Army General Staff Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov about a prolonged guerrilla war, his fears were dismissed, with assurances that the occupation would be straightforward and short. Amin's government had lost the trust of the Afghan people due to unpopular reforms, disorganization, a failing economy, police brutality, and anti-Muslim policies. In just 20 months of Khalq rule, Afghanistan had deteriorated significantly. The USSR believed that without intervention, Amin's government would fall to the Mujahideen, and Afghanistan would become hostile to Soviet interests. The decision was made to remove Amin. Preparations for the occupation began with 6 objectives: stabilizing the country by occupying major cities, air bases, supply facilities, and key routes, relieving Afghan forces from garrison duties to fight the insurgency, supplying the Afghan army with intelligence, artillery, air, and logistical support, having minimum contact with the local population, accepting a small number of Soviet casualties, and strengthening Afghan forces for eventual Soviet withdrawal. In early December, 1,500 Soviet troops were sent to Bagram Air Force Base, north of Kabul, joining 400 already stationed there. Amin, believing these troops were for his regime's protection, welcomed the deployment. Additional air support and motorized rifle divisions were assembled and moved to staging points on the Soviet-Afghan border in mid-December. On Christmas Day 1979, the Soviets initiated a massive airlift of troops and equipment, disguised as international aid. Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov ordered the crossing of the Afghan border by forces of the 40th Army and Air Force. Airborne units from Turkestan, along with those from western and southern USSR, moved into Afghanistan. Approximately 4,000 soldiers in armored vehicles traveled to Kabul, while smaller groups moved into Shindand and Kandahar. Amin was fully aware of these movements, having requested assistance from the Soviets a week prior. On December 23, the Russian newspaper Pravda denied the presence of combat troops in Afghanistan. Amin, convinced his request for troops had been granted, thanked the Russians and instructed the DRA Armed Forces General Staff to support the deploying men. Unaware of the true motive, he was persuaded to relocate to Tajbeg Palace for better defense. On December 27, 1979, Spetsnaz Special Forces stormed the heavily fortified palace, killing Amin, his family, and advisors. Within 48 hours, Babruk Karmal, the Parkham faction leader, was brought out of exile and became the new president, marking the beginning of the Soviet occupation. International condemnation of the Soviet invasion was swift and widespread. U.S. President Jimmy Carter called it the most serious threat to world peace since the Second World War, and withdrew from the SALT II Treaty on January 2, 1980. A week later, the UN Security Council strongly criticized Soviet actions. By the end of January, 34 Muslim-majority countries, including Afghanistan's worried neighbor Pakistan, condemned the intervention and demanded the immediate withdrawal of Soviet troops. The U.S., fearing further Soviet expansion, implemented a trade embargo and, along with 65 other nations, boycotted the Moscow Olympic Games. Aid to the Mujahideen, previously minimal from countries like the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Libya, and Kuwait, increased significantly. Soviet forces, entering Afghanistan via 2 ground routes and 1 air corridor, quickly seized control of major cities, military bases, and strategic facilities. They expected to be welcomed as liberators from Amin's brutal rule and anticipated the Mujahideen's immediate surrender. Instead, the Soviet presence intensified nationalist sentiments, fueling further rebellion. The Red Army, though attempting to leave the fighting to the Afghans, often found themselves engaged in hostilities against urban unrest, tribal forces, Lashkar, and even rebelling Afghan army units. In the early days of the occupation, attacks on Soviet troops were common in Kabul, with civilians frequently killing them in broad daylight. Within weeks, between 50,000 and 60,000 Red Army soldiers arrived, along with over 4,000 civilian advisors and technicians to help establish Karmal's new administration. Sporadic civil unrest erupted in cities like Kandahar and Herat, while guerrillas in northern and eastern Afghanistan escalated their assaults against the loyal Afghan army. Karmal's provisional constitution promised reforms and free expression, but he failed to unite the PDPA and was widely perceived as a Soviet puppet. By spring, 81,000 Red Army soldiers were in Afghanistan. In February 1980, just 2 months after the Soviet intervention, the 3-Hoot uprising in Kabul saw thousands of Islamists and leftists protest the Karmal government, resulting in mass arrests and hundreds of deaths. Simultaneously, a Soviet push into Paktia province in eastern Afghanistan led to the loss of a Soviet battalion. In April and May, Soviet soldiers and PDPA allies massacred dozens of protesting students during another urban rebellion. The war evolved into a new pattern. The Afghan Mujahideen, whom Soviet soldiers called the enemy, or Dutchman, fragmented into smaller units and waged a guerrilla war in the mountains, while the Soviets controlled cities and main communication lines. Despite deploying the 105th Airborne and 7 motorized rifle divisions, totaling about 85,000 troops, the Soviets, while quickly seizing urban and primary routes, lacked the tools and expertise to defeat the Mujahideen in the hostile countryside. Failing to engage their enemy directly, the Soviets implemented a scorched earth policy, devastating land, crops, farms, irrigation systems, and cattle. This forced over 5 million Afghans to flee their homes and become refugees in Pakistan and Iran, housed in large refugee camps. Fighting an enemy that viewed death as an honor and a path to martyrdom proved terrifying and harsh for young Soviet recruits, who were often despised by the Mujahideen and most of the Afghan population for their atheism. The war quickly became Russia's Vietnam, with high casualty rates among young Soviet soldiers, earning them the nickname Zinky Boys due to the zinc-lined coffins used to transport their bodies home. It became clear that hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops would be needed to defeat the estimated 200,000 Mujahideen. By early 1982, Soviet troop numbers reached between 105,000 to 110,000. By the end of that year, the Soviets had suffered 10,000 casualties. In autumn 1982, when Yuri Andropov succeeded Leonid Brezhnev as head of state, the Soviet war in Afghanistan shifted. While intentional migratory genocide assaults continued to demoralize the civilian population and eliminate Mujahideen supporters, a new strategy involved the methodical implementation of KGB-style subversion. This included economic and psychological pressures, agent provocateurs, bribes, and threats of imprisonment to invite or split loyalty among the resistance, tribes, and ethnic clans. Upon becoming U.S. president in 1981, Ronald Reagan significantly increased the shipment of arms and aid to the Mujahideen through Pakistan and its Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI. This resistance movement, costing Moscow dearly in terms of money, lives, and dignity, was aided by the US, Pakistan, UK, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, China, and others. The US, viewing the conflict as a fundamental part of the Cold War, provided assistance to anti-Soviet forces through Operation Cyclone, arming and financing the Afghan Mujahideen. This transformed Pakistan's northwest frontier province into a base for Afghan resistance fighters. Muslim nations also volunteered thousands of Afghan Arabs, including the infamous Osama bin Laden, who later founded Al-Qaeda, to wage jihad against the atheist communists. By the end of the conflict, the US had invested $3 billion in financing the Mujahideen. Heavy fighting continued in Herat in 1981, along with an unsuccessful operation by Afghan Republican forces in the northern province of Balkh. By 1984, insurgents were encouraged to undertake sabotage raids inside the USSR. In spring 1985, rebels began cross-border attacks, and 2 years later, they conducted coordinated incursions on several targets over the Soviet border, reaching as far as 10 miles into Soviet territory in an attack on a factory in Uzbek SSR. The Soviets responded by threatening to invade Pakistan, after which no further incidents were reported. The Afghan guerrilla commander Ahmad Shah Massoud proved particularly challenging for the Soviets. A truce in 1983 allowed him to restructure and strengthen his forces. Attempts to assassinate Massoud by Karmal's secret police chief, Mohammad Najibullah, failed. Massoud, who actively fought against the Taliban from 1996, was eventually assassinated 2 days before the 9/11 attacks in America in 2001. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Union. Just as Amin had been blamed for Afghanistan's problems, Karmal was now seen as a failure. Gorbachev stated that Karmal was hoping to continue sitting in Kabul with our help, and that without a change in approach, the Soviets would be fighting there for another 20 or 30 years. Although it's unclear when exactly Soviet authorities began pushing for Karmal's termination, Andrei Gromyko discussed Karmal's resignation with UN Secretary-General Javier Pérez de Cuellar in 1982. Gorbachev's plan was to replace Karmal with Mohammad Najibullah, an Afghan military officer and politician known as Dr. Najib, who had become head of the Afghan Secret Police, KHAD, in 1980 and was known for his brutal efficiency. In November 1985, Karmal, realizing he had lost Soviet support, resigned and was exiled to Moscow, where he died in 1996. In May of that year, Najibullah was elected General Secretary and then President of the Revolutionary Council. Despite his relative youth and unfamiliarity to the Afghan people, he quickly implemented reforms to improve the nation's circumstances and gain support. Fluent in both Pashto and Dari, Najibullah skillfully interacted with elders and incorporated Quranic passages into his speeches to portray himself and the state as Islamic. The night curfew in Kabul, in effect since 1980, was lifted, and several rebel prisoners were released. Concurrently, the US and UK military trained the Mujahideen, supplying them with highly effective FIM-92 Stinger surface-to-air missiles, which could be carried by mule and launched from the shoulder. The Stingers forced Soviet helicopters to fly too high for effective air cover, significantly boosting the Mujahideen's fortunes. Unfortunately, within 15 years, many of these US-trained rebels would join the Taliban and use their skills against the very nations that had helped them. The Geneva Accords were signed in 1988 after lengthy discussions between Afghanistan and Pakistan, backed by the United States and the Soviet Union. Both Asian nations pledged to avoid meddling in each other's affairs and consented to the voluntary return of Afghan refugees in Pakistan. The agreement also included the Soviet Union's withdrawal from Afghanistan. A UN special mission was established to supervise the procedure. President Najibullah had successfully solidified his political standing and coordinated with Moscow for the withdrawal. The Geneva Accords established a timeline for the complete Soviet withdrawal and for US and Soviet non-intervention in the affairs of both Pakistan and Afghanistan. Gorbachev's new thinking on domestic and foreign policy, including his glasnost, openness and transparency, and perestroika, economic restructuring, concepts, paved the way for the withdrawal and aimed to end the era of stagnation, moving away from the old Soviet model of a closed and secretive society. To further ease Cold War tensions, Gorbachev also signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with the US in 1987. As the invasion entered its final phase, Soviet forces began their withdrawal, restricting remaining troops from launching further offensive actions. The Red Army's first and second halves were removed between May and August 1988, and November and February 1989, respectively. The Soviets negotiated ceasefires with local Mujahideen commanders to ensure safe transit. The withdrawal was largely peaceful, except for Operation Typhoon in January 1989, aimed at causing maximum damage to opposition forces in central and northern provinces. Soviet estimates claimed over 600 of Massoud's fighters were killed in this assault. The last Soviet troops left Afghanistan on February 15, 1989. General Boris Gromov, the very last Soviet soldier to leave, stated upon crossing the Friendship Bridge into Soviet Uzbekistan, "There is not a single Soviet soldier or officer left behind me. Our 9-year war is over." However, for Afghans, a new war was about to begin. Mohammad Najibullah and his government remained in power until April 15, 1992, when Najibullah resigned as Mujahideen forces entered Kabul. His attempt to fly to India under UN protection was thwarted, and he took refuge at a UN compound in the city. After 4 bloody years of fighting among various anti-Najibullah groups, the Taliban took control of Kabul. In September 1996, the Taliban stormed the UN compound, tortured, and killed Najibullah. Retired General Mohammad Yahya Naraz of the Army of Afghanistan summarized the Soviet-Afghan War as a rare confrontation that helped trigger the collapse of the greatest empire of modern times. He emphasized that no army, regardless of its sophistication or resources, can succeed without psychological fitness and motivation, while a force with strong faith, stubborn determination, individualism, and unending patience will always prevail. In 1989, American journalist Patrick Browen concisely explained the Soviet defeat. They got sucked into Afghanistan much as the United States got sucked into Vietnam, without clearly thinking through the consequences and wildly underestimating the hostility they would arouse.